The two red dresses were the first thing Jedediah Croft saw, a slash of impossible color against the dusty brown of Redemption Flats, Nevada. They stood beside the telegraph office, identical figures in silk that shimmered under the brutal August sun of 1878. The advertisement he'd placed in the territorial newspaper had been for one wife, a plain woman of good character, willing to share a life carved out of a mountainside. He had imagined someone sturdy, weathered, and quiet. What he got was a joke, and the whole town had turned out to watch him get it. Jedediah was a man built on the scale of the mountains he called home. He stood a full head taller than any man in town, with shoulders that strained the seams of his buckskin shirt and a beard that fell to his chest, as wild and untamed as his long, dark hair. He was a man of few words and fewer visits to town, a fact that made him an object of both suspicion and speculation. Therefore, when his mail-order bride was due to arrive, the freight agent, a weasel-faced man named Alistair Finch, had made it his business to ensure a crowd. Finch was the architect of this humiliation. He'd taken Jedediah's carefully worded request, and with the help of some business associates in San Francisco, had turned it into a cruel spectacle. The telegraph message confirming their arrival had been read aloud in the saloon the night before. "2 for the price of 1, Finch had crowed. "The ugliest Chinese twins you ever did see. A joke for the big man on the mountain." Now the laughter was a low rumble around him, like distant thunder. The twins stood perfectly still, their hands clasped before them, their faces impassive. They were small, delicate-looking women, their black hair pulled back in tight, intricate knots. The red dresses, though beautiful, made them targets, branding them as foreign, as other. They did not look at the crowd. They looked only at the dust in front of their cloth shoes. Jedediah felt a slow burn start in his belly. It wasn't embarrassment. It was rage, cold and deliberate. He had asked for a partner, not a spectacle. But here it was, and a decision had to be made in the open, under the judging eyes of every soul in Redemption Flats. He could turn them away, send them back on the next wagon, and cement his status as a fool. Or he could do something else entirely. The white horse hitched to his wagon snorted, shaking its mane, and the simple sound seemed to cut through the noise. Jedediah moved. He didn't hurry, his worn leather boots making no sound in the thick dust. He walked past Finch, who was grinning with yellow teeth, and stopped in front of the two women. They were 20 years old, maybe, their faces thin and their eyes holding a deep, weary stillness that had nothing to do with their age. He saw no ugliness. He saw two people a long way from home, standing on the edge of the world with nothing but each other. He saw the same thing he saw in the mirror most mornings, a survivor. He cleared his throat, his voice a low rumble. "I'm Jedediah Croft." One of the women looked up, her gaze meeting his for a fraction of a second before dropping again. She gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. The other did the same. They did not speak. "You the man who sent for a wife?" Finch called out, his voice slick with false cheer. "Looks like you got a bonus." Jedediah ignored him. He gestured with his head toward his wagon, a sturdy buckboard laden with sacks of flour, salt, and coffee. "The ride is long," he said, his words meant only for them. "My home is in the mountains." Without a word, the two women picked up the small, cloth-wrapped bundles at their feet and walked toward the wagon. They moved with a synchronized grace, as if they were two parts of a single being. They climbed onto the wagon seat, arranging their red dresses around them, and sat with their backs straight, their eyes fixed on the horizon. They took up no more space than one of the sturdy women he had imagined. Jedediah turned and faced Alistair Finch. The freight agent's smile faltered, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. The town's laughter had died down. replaced by a confused silence. This wasn't the reaction they'd expected. They had anticipated outrage, rejection, a public display of wounded pride. They had not anticipated quiet acceptance. "You owe me for the passage," Finch said, regaining some of his swagger. "Special delivery. Cost extra." Jedediah reached into his pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch. He counted out the silver coins into his palm, the exact amount agreed upon in the telegraphs. He didn't add a penny more. He pressed the coins into Finch's hand, his grip firm enough to make the smaller man wince. "We are concluded," Jedediah said, his voice flat and final. He walked to his wagon, unhitched the horse, and climbed onto the driver's seat. He didn't look back at the town. He didn't need to. He could feel their eyes on his back, their whispers turning from mockery to puzzlement. He clucked his tongue, and the white horse leaned into its harness, pulling the wagon forward. The wheels groaned as they turned, kicking up a cloud of dust that slowly obscured the town of Redemption Flats. The two women beside him did not move, their red dresses a defiant flame against the vast, indifferent landscape. The joke had been played, but Jedediah was about to find out that a cruel joke was the least of the troubles he had just invited into his life. The journey to his homestead was a silent one, measured by the rhythmic clopping of the horse's hooves and the creak of the wagon. The sun beat down, and the heat rising from the parched earth was relentless. Jedediah had lived in these mountains for 10 years, and he knew their moods. He knew the way the light changed in the canyons, and the sound the wind made through the ponderosa pines. But he had never shared it with anyone. The presence of the two women beside him was a strange weight, a disruption to the deep solitude he had cultivated. He stopped once, at a small creek that cut through the foothills. He watered the horse and refilled his canteen. He offered it to the women. The one on his left, who seemed a fraction bolder than her sister, took it with a murmur of thanks, so quiet it was nearly lost in the gurgle of the water. She drank, then passed it to her sister. They moved with an economy of motion that spoke of long hardship. When they were done, she handed the canteen back, her fingers brushing his. Her skin was cool. As they climbed higher, the air grew thinner and the landscape more rugged. The dirt track narrowed, hemmed in by granite cliffs on one side and a steep drop on the other. It was here that the external crisis erupted. As they rounded a sharp bend, a large boulder, dislodged by the summer heat or a passing animal, sat squarely in the middle of the path. It was too big to move and too large to go around. The cliff face was sheer, and the drop-off was 100 feet to a dry riverbed. They were trapped. Jedediah swore under his breath and pulled the horse to a halt. He got down from the wagon, his mind already working the problem. He could try to break the rock with his sledgehammer, but that would take hours, and they would lose the light. He could unhitch the horse and try to lead it around, but the wagon would have to be left behind, along with his supplies. He stood there, a giant of a man rendered helpless by a piece of stone. It was then that one of the women spoke. "There is a way," she said. Her voice was clear, though accented. It was the first full sentence either of them had uttered. Jedediah turned. She was pointing up, at the cliff face above the boulder. "The rock is balanced," she said. Her sister, standing beside her, nodded in agreement. He looked where she was pointing. He saw nothing but sheer rock. "Balanced on what?" he asked, his tone skeptical. "Not on," she corrected gently. "With. There is a keystone." She pointed again to a smaller wedge-shaped rock about 20 feet up the cliff, directly above the boulder blocking their path. "If that one is moved, the big one will fall." Jedediah squinted, his eyes tracing the lines in the granite. Now that she had pointed it out, he could see it. The massive boulder was part of an old rock slide, and it was indeed precariously propped against the cliff, held in place by a complex geometry of pressure. The small stone she indicated was the linchpin. But getting to it was impossible. The cliff was too steep to climb. He was a man of immense physical strength, but that strength was useless here. He was outmatched by the specific nature of the problem. This was a puzzle, not a test of force. He felt a familiar frustration rising. This was why he preferred the solitude of the mountains. It was simple. You chopped wood, you hunted, you survived. You didn't have to outthink a mountain. But his new companions were not deterred. The two women were already moving. They went to the back of the wagon and began untying the ropes that held a long coil of hemp rope and a block and tackle Jedediah used for hoisting game. He watched, stunned into inaction, as they worked together in silent, perfect coordination. One of them, whose name he still did not know, fashioned a loop at one end of the rope. The other scouted the base of the cliff, her eyes scanning the rock face. She found a narrow fissure, a crack running diagonally up the cliff, ending a few feet to the side of the keystone. It was too narrow for a man of Jedediah's size, but for them it was a ladder. The first sister handed the coiled rope to the second. Without a word of discussion, the second sister began to climb. She moved like a spider, her small frame seeming to stick to the rock. Her fingers and toes found purchase in crevices Jedediah couldn't even see. The red silk of her dress was a liability, catching on sharp edges, but she moved with a slow, deliberate grace that was breathtaking to watch. The sister on the ground watched her ascent, her body tense, her hands clasped. Jedediah found himself holding his breath. When the climber was level with the keystone, she paused, bracing herself in the fissure. She uncoiled the rope and, with a flick of her wrist, tossed the looped end. It sailed through the air and settled perfectly over a knob of rock just above the keystone. It was a throw that spoke of 1,000 hours of practice. She pulled it tight, testing the anchor. Then she began to set up a simple lever using the rope and a stout piece of wood she'd carried up with her. Down below, Finch and the town of Redemption Flats had judged these women as weak, as a joke. But here, on the side of a mountain, Jedediah was witnessing a display of competence and courage that shamed every man who had laughed. They weren't just survivors, they were engineers. The climber gave a sharp cry, and the sister on the ground, along with Jedediah, took hold of the other end of the rope. "Now!" the climber called. They pulled. The rope went taut, the hemp groaning under the strain. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a deep, grinding sound, the keystone shifted. It moved only an inch, but it was enough. A shower of pebbles rained down. The massive boulder below them groaned, a deep, resonant sound that vibrated through the soles of Jedediah's boots. "Again!" They pulled again, putting all their weight into it. The keystone popped loose with a sharp crack and tumbled down the cliff. The great boulder hesitated for a heartbeat, and then, with a deafening roar, it tipped forward and plunged into the canyon below. It crashed into the dry riverbed, sending up a plume of dust that rose into the sky. The path was clear. A profound silence descended, broken only by the nervous whinny of the horse. The woman on the cliff face carefully made her way back down. When she reached the ground, her sister met her, checking her hands for scrapes. They stood together for a moment, a quiet exchange of glances passing between them. Then they turned to Jedediah. The one who had climbed spoke, her breath coming in slight gasps. "My name is Bow," she said. She gestured to her sister. "This is Anne." Jedediah could only nod. The surface conflict was resolved. The path was clear. But as he looked at the two women standing before him, their red dresses now smudged with dust and grime, he realized the boulder had been the simple part. He had brought home a mystery far more complex and dangerous than a rock slide. He was about to find out that clearing a path was one thing, but knowing where it led was another matter entirely. That evening they reached his cabin. It was a simple, sturdy structure built of hand-hewn logs nestled in a small meadow overlooking a valley. A thin curl of smoke rose from the stone chimney, a welcome sight. Inside, a fire was already banked in the hearth. The cabin was one large room, spare and clean, with a bed in one corner, a table and 2 chairs in the center, and shelves holding neatly stacked supplies. It was a space built for one. The silence, which had been a comfort to him for years, now felt vast and awkward. On and Bao moved about the small space with a quiet efficiency that was both unnerving and deeply calming. While he tended to the horse, they unpacked the supplies from the wagon. By the time he came inside, a pot of water was boiling over the fire, and the scent of coffee filled the room. Anne was sweeping the floor with a broom made of birch twigs. Bao was wiping down the table with a damp cloth. They didn't speak, but they moved around each other with the frictionless ease of long practice, turning his solitary shelter into a shared home in a matter of minutes. He sat at the table, feeling large and useless in his own house. They served him a cup of coffee and then sat on a small wooden chest against the far wall, their hands folded in their laps, waiting. It was clear they expected him to set the terms of this new, strange life. "You can have the bed," he said, his voice sounding rough in the quiet room. "I will sleep by the fire." Anne and Bao exchanged a look. It was An who spoke. "We do not require the bed of the master of the house." "I am not your master," Jedediah said, the words coming out sharper than he intended. "And this is your house now, too." The statement hung in the air between them. It was more than they had expected, and more than he had known he would offer. He saw a flicker of something in their eyes, surprise, maybe even hope. Later, after a simple meal of bread and salted pork, the quiet returned. The fire crackled, casting long shadows on the log walls. Jedediah sat on the floor, leaning against the stone hearth, watching the flames. An and Bao sat at the table, their hands busy with some mending. It was in this quiet that the truth began to surface. "Mr. Finch, in the town," Bao began, her voice soft. "He told us you were a monster, a giant who lived in a cave and ate animals raw." Jedediah grunted. "Finch is a fool." "He said our family sent us as a punishment," Anne added, her needle pausing in its work, "because we were not beautiful enough to marry a rich man in our own country." Jedediah looked at them, truly looked at them, away from the prying eyes of the town. He saw high cheekbones, intelligent eyes, and a strength in the set of their jaws that no pampered society wife could ever possess. "Finch is a liar, too," he said. A long silence settled. Then, Bao reached into a small embroidered pouch she wore at her waist. She pulled out a letter, the paper worn soft and thin at the creases. It was covered in Chinese characters. She held it in her hands for a moment, as if gathering her strength, before she spoke. "Our family did not send us as a joke," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "They sent us to save us. Our village is gone. A flood came in the spring. It took everything, the fields, the houses, our parents." She looked down at the letter, her knuckles white. "The man who arranged our passage to America, he was not a kind man. He owned our family's debt. He told us we would work for him in San Francisco, in a place for men. We chose this. We chose you." The words hit the room like a physical blow. The story Finch had spun, of a cruel joke, of unwanted daughters, was a lie designed to conceal a much uglier truth. These women weren't a joke. They were refugees, sold into a life they had desperately sought to escape. Their quiet dignity was not passivity. It was the armor of people who had lost everything but themselves. Jedediah felt that cold rage from the town square return, but this time it was 100 times hotter. It was directed not just at Finch, but at a world that could take 2 people like this and grind them down into a commodity, a debt to be collected. He stood up and walked to the small window, looking out at the moonlit valley. "This man in San Francisco," he said, his back to them. "Does he know you are here?" "He knows we were sent to Redemption Flats," Ann answered. "He believes the joke will be on you, that you would refuse us. Then Mr. Finch would send us back to him." Jedediah turned around. "Finch is in business with him." It wasn't a question. Bow nodded, her eyes wide with a fear she no longer tried to hide. "They trade in things, and in people." The pieces clicked into place. This wasn't just a cruel prank. It was a business transaction, and he was an unwitting pawn. Finch had arranged it so that no matter what Jedediah did, the man from San Francisco would get what he wanted. If Jedediah rejected them, Finch would collect them. If he accepted them, they were still on land Finch and his associates were trying to drive him from. Jedediah's homestead included the only year-round spring on this side of the mountain, a fact the railroad surveyors had noted with great interest. Suddenly, the front door burst open. Alistair Finch stood on the threshold, flanked by two rough-looking men Jedediah had seen working on the railroad grade. They were armed with rifles. Finch's weaselly face was stretched into a triumphant smirk. "Evening, Croft," he said, stepping into the cabin. His eyes darted around the room, taking in the scene. "I see you got the girls settled in. I trust the merchandise is satisfactory?" Jedediah moved to stand between Finch and the women. Ann and Bow had risen to their feet, their faces pale. "Get out of my house, Finch," Jedediah said, his voice a low growl. Now, is that any way to talk to a business partner?" Finch said, feigning injury. "See, there's been a misunderstanding, a clerical error. These two were meant for another client, a Mr. Sterling in San Francisco. I've just come to correct the delivery." He held up a piece of paper. "It's a debt instrument, duly signed. They belong to him, and he's empowered me to collect." The two men with him raised their rifles slightly, the message clear. This was beyond territorial law. This was a private matter, to be settled with force on a remote mountainside where no marshal would hear the shots. Jedediah looked from the guns to the faces of An and Bow. He saw the terror in their eyes, the final, desperate plea. He could give them up. He could let Finch take them and go back to his quiet, solitary life. It would be the safe choice, the sensible choice. No one would blame him. But as he looked at them, he didn't see merchandise. He saw the woman who had climbed a cliff face. He saw the woman who had made his house a home in 2 hours. He saw the letter, worn soft from 1,000 readings. He had spent 10 years building a life of solitude, a fortress against the world. But a fortress is also a prison. He made a choice. It was a choice that would cost him his peace, his safety, and maybe his life. He took a step forward, planting his feet. He was unarmed, but his size and the sheer force of his will filled the small cabin. "They are not merchandise," Jedediah said, his voice calm and deadly. "They are my wives, and you are on my land. You have 10 seconds to leave it." Finch laughed, a high, nervous sound. "Wives? You can't marry them. There's no preacher, no paperwork. It's not legal." "On this mountain," Jedediah said, his eyes never leaving Finch's, "I am the law. And the paperwork is you leaving in one piece." He took another step. "Your 10 seconds are running out." The two hired guns shifted nervously. They had signed on to intimidate a lonely mountain man, not to face down a force of nature. They saw the look in Jedediah's eyes and knew he was not bluffing. He would not survive a gunfight, but he would take them all with him. Finch's smirk vanished, replaced by a snarl of frustration. He had miscalculated. He had assumed the mountain man was a simpleton, a brute who could be easily manipulated and cowed. He had not counted on a man of principle. "This isn't over, Croft," Finch hissed, backing toward the door. "Sterling will hear about this. The railroad wants this spring. You can't fight us all." He and his men retreated into the night, leaving the door gaping open. The cold night air rushed in. Jedediah stood for a long moment, listening until the sound of their horses faded into the distance. Then he slowly turned and closed the door, sliding the heavy wooden bar into place. He looked at An and Bao. They were staring at him, their expressions a mixture of awe, relief, and disbelief. He had called them his wives. He had claimed them, defended them, and in doing so had declared war on powerful men. The quiet life he had built was gone forever. But as he looked at the two women who now stood with him in the warm firelight, he felt not a sense of loss, but the strange, unfamiliar feeling of having something to fight for. By the following spring, the mountain had changed. The threat from Finch and his associates had not vanished, but it had receded into a tense stalemate. Jedediah had sent a letter to the U.S. Marshal in Carson City, detailing Finch's attempt at armed collection of a false debt. He had no proof, but the formal complaint, delivered by a freighter he trusted, put Finch on notice. An open attack would now bring federal attention, something the railroad's land agents wished to avoid. For now, they were safe. The cabin was no longer a solitary shelter, but a bustling, thriving homestead. An and Bao had revealed a deep, almost instinctual knowledge of growing things. They had cleared a patch of land near the spring, and using seeds they had carefully carried with them from their homeland, had cultivated a garden that defied the rocky soil. By May, neat rows of greens, beans, and strange, delicious melons were flourishing. They taught Jedediah how to build a small levee of stone and mud to irrigate the garden, a technique that doubled its yield. Jedediah, in turn, shared his knowledge of the mountain. He taught them which roots were edible, how to read the tracks of deer and elk, and how to predict the weather by the clouds that gathered over the highest peaks. They worked together, a silent partnership that slowly blossomed into a quiet language of shared tasks and mutual respect. He expanded the cabin, adding a second room with 2 proper beds. The 3 of them fell into a rhythm dictated by the seasons, a life that was hard but deeply satisfying. The community of Redemption Flats, which had once mocked him, now watched with a grudging admiration. Freighters who made the trip up the mountain to trade for his pelts brought back stories of a homestead transformed. They spoke of the incredible garden, of the cabin's neatness, of the 2 quiet women who worked alongside the mountain man with a fierce and gentle competence. The cruel joke had lost its humor. In its place grew a legend. One afternoon in June, Jedediah returned from checking his trap lines to find An and Bao waiting for him by the spring. They were wearing the red dresses. He hadn't seen them since the day they arrived, and the sight of the brilliant color against the green of their garden was startling. They had mended and cleaned them, and the silk shone in the afternoon sun. "We wish to go to the town," An said, her voice formal. Jedediah's hand instinctively went to the axe on his belt. "Is it Finch?" "No," Bao said quickly. "It is the preacher." "The circuit preacher is in town. We heard it from the freighter." She looked at her sister, then back at Jedediah. "You called us your wives. You have treated us as such. You have given us your name and your protection. We wish to make it true, in the eyes of your God and your law." He looked at them, standing so straight and proud in their impossible red dresses. They were not asking for his protection anymore. They were claiming their place, not just on his mountain, but in his life. They were offering him the one thing he had never known he wanted, a family. "All right," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. "Hitch the wagon." The journey back to Redemption Flats was the opposite of their first. He sat between them on the wagon seat. They did not ride in silence this time, but spoke in low tones about the crops, about the coming summer. When they arrived, the town stared as it had before, but this time the stares were not of ridicule, but of awe. Jedediah Croft, the wild man of the mountain, rode through the center of town with two beautiful women in brilliant red dresses, their heads held high. He stopped the wagon not at the freight office, but in front of the small, clapboard church. The circuit preacher, a thin man with a kind face, met them on the steps. He had already heard the story, as everyone had. He looked at Jedediah, then at Ann and Bow. He saw no joke. He saw three people who had forged a life together out of hardship and decency. In the territories, the law was often what you made it, and God's grace was found in the most unlikely of arrangements. "The good book speaks of a man leaving his family and cleaving unto his wife, and they shall become one flesh," the preacher said, his voice carrying in the quiet street. "It is less specific on the arithmetic." He gave them a small, wry smile. "But I see a family here, and that is a holy thing in any language." And so, under the Nevada sun, with the whole town as their witness, Jedediah Croft took Ann and Bow as his wives. There was no fine music, no grand ceremony. There was only the simple, clear-eyed declaration of three people choosing to belong to one another. That evening, as they rode home, the setting sun lit the mountains in hues of orange and purple. The red dresses of his wives seemed to capture the last of the light. He looked at the deed for his homestead, now legally registered in 3 names, a document that was more than a claim to land. It was a testament. In a world that often rewarded cruelty and greed, they had built something decent. And he learned that a man's heart isn't a fortress to be defended, but a home to be shared, and its true size is measured by how many it can welcome inside.